I mean, the flip-flop on the task force, of course, may be a little unreassuring to people who want to feel there's real leadership here. But it's an interesting question of just the guidance that this White House has shown on COVID-19 and whether blame will be assigned. Do you come down on that? Does any of this attach to Trump long term?
Oh, sure. I mean, we're going to experience the worst economic recession of our lifetimes. So, I mean, even if he were a fantastic president executing on everything well, he would take a big hit for that. And, of course, he's not. It's quite mixed. As he's very happy and eager to tell us all, he did shut down travel from China comparatively early when the Europeans, when the Japanese, the South Koreans did not. That helped. But he was not on it at all in terms of getting tests up and running to scale. He was not on it in terms of helping unify healthcare response and the critical medical supplies that we need. And he's kind of abdicated in terms of a lot of the leadership aligning governors in reopening economies. Though finally he's been strong on the economic side so far, which has been bipartisan, but in his administration, and the Fed has been very effective. So at best he gets a middling grade in a deeply polarized environment and where he's not a very inspirational and unifying figure. Remember, after 9/11, President Bush had a 92% approval rating. Trump's highest rating so far blended is 46. It's half of that, and he's not getting over that in my view.
And of course, given this dynamic, we are now seeing the blame game being played out against Beijing as well. President Trump at one point claiming that Beijing wants to damage his election campaign. When it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, which is better for Beijing, to be dealing with President Trump, who's so spontaneous, who really, you can't really tell where he's going to go with foreign policy, or with a potentially Democratic president in the White House?
It's a controversial question, and the Chinese are grappling it with themselves. I wouldn't say that they all agree, but they do feel like U.S. politics towards China will be more problematic going forward, irrespective of whether it's Trump or Biden. It is the one issue that you see broad bipartisan agreement in the United States that you should have a tougher policy towards China. If it's Biden, there's much more focus on human rights issues, treatment of the Uyghurs, Hong Kong. If it's Trump, you get much tougher line on national security issues, South China Sea. They're both pretty hard line on Chinese economic practices, IP theft, and technology. The one place that the Chinese senior leaders I've spoken to come out actually preferring Trump for another term is they think that Trump has so alienated relations with American allies that it provides more space for the Chinese to operate geopolitically. But I wouldn't say that they feel strongly about that. And the idea that Trump says that the Chinese want him to lose, that's purely him posturing in talking about how the Chinese might intervene in cyber in the elections the way the Russians did in 2016. That's purely for domestic politics.
As you mentioned, with the United States sort of withdrawing from the global stage, how much of an opening does this provide to China and the Beijing government? Because we have seen them expanding or trying to expand their influence in places like Latin America, in Africa. Now, are we going to see an ideological battle here where these developing nations will be forced to choose between the Chinese style of government against American democracy? And perhaps after the pandemic, they'll think, you know what, China looks good.
Well, it's important that you mention the developing world because, of course, Canada's not going to be looking at that. They have no choice. The Mexicans won't. They have no choice. The Europeans, the wealthy Europeans, are largely aligned with the United States. That won't change even though they don't like Trump. Same with Japan. But when you talk about the poorer countries, like sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of their external debt is with the Chinese. So, I mean, even if they wanted to head towards the United States, there isn't another credible option. China has Belt and Road. The United States has nothing in particular that's comparable. Add to that the fact that the Chinese supply chain is back up and running this summer while the Americans and the Europeans are still shut down. Certainly you're going to see more alignment among the world's poorest countries, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, East and Southern Europe and South America, towards China. But it's because of that. It's not because the Chinese are doing so much in humanitarian aid. they've overstated that. The actual numbers are pretty small. It's not because the Chinese are going to lead the bailout of the poorest countries that they're going to need going forward. The IMF will still take the biggest role there.
Ian, I do want you to weigh in on what is becoming a bigger piece of this conversation, and that is whether or not inflation is the thing that we have to fear, including stagflation, inflation in the midst of a depression.
Not yet, and I certainly think coming out of this, the markets are telling you on the back of the Fed that they still feel pretty comfortable that you're not going to have that problem near term. That people are still going to fly to the dollar because they're worried about the competitiveness of other economies, and this is a flight to quality. Long term, though, I mean, with increasing indebtedness and with larger numbers of Americans out of work and an unwind of some of globalization that leads to less efficiency and less quality growth globally, you have to worry about inflation increasing. And this debt is going to have to be paid. I mean, whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, you're going to have a much more challenging fiscal environment in the United States in 2 and 3 years' time. And clearly, I think taxation is going to rise significantly, not just against wealthy Americans, but also against the corporate environment. And so if you're hoping that the corporates are going to be the leaders on the social contract, their challenges are going to grow too.